Imagine a small kingdom surrounded by mountains and dense forests, where order was not guaranteed and each individual followed their own rules. Now imagine that in this isolated kingdom, the first laws were born that shaped the entire history of humanity. How did this happen? Let's find out. In the beginning, the first civilizations lived without a formalized governance structure. Laws and rules were transmitted orally, based on customs, traditions, and the authority of local leaders. Decisions were often made arbitrarily, depending on the power or will of whoever was in control. The concept of justice varied drastically between different tribes and regions, with each people interpreting what was right and wrong in their own unique way. This disorganized environment created uncertainty, as people did not know for sure what they could or could not do, and the risk of being unfairly punished was always a present threat. Without a set of fixed rules, conflicts between the inhabitants and neighboring tribes were frequent, and peace seemed a distant and elusive goal. Although there was a certain order in primitive societies, it was deeply rooted in the power of individuals or families who led groups. Justice was often determined by the strength or influence of those in authority. In some cultures, disputes were settled through combat, while others used a system of judgment based on rituals, which could be more subjective and not always fair. This created constant tension, as those who were not in positions of power were often forced to accept decisions that did not favor their interests or needs. The absence of clear and universal rules resulted in a cycle of uncertainty and inequality, where only the strongest or most cunning could assert their rights. It was in this context of insecurity and inequality that the need for significant change arose. Visionary leaders began to realize that a kingdom or society could not thrive without clear rules and a way to ensure that everyone was treated fairly. The idea of creating a system of laws that was comprehensive and applied equally to all was an important innovation. The need to regulate human behavior, protect citizens' rights, and establish norms that would allow peaceful coexistence was the first step toward creating a more structured legal system. The transition from a personal justice system based on force to an impersonal system based on collective norms was a great step forward for humanity. The search for a more organized legal structure was not limited to the need to resolve disputes, but also to the desire to ensure the continuity and growth of a society. For a kingdom to prosper, it needed a system that regulated relations between its members, resolved conflicts equitably, and provided stability to the political and social environment. With the increase in commercial interactions and the expansion of territories, the importance of standardized justice became even more evident. A model of governance was needed that did not depend on individual decisions, and that could be implemented fairly throughout the kingdom. Thus, the creation of the first laws represented not only a solution to the problems of inequality and insecurity, but also the beginning of a new era in social and political organization. As societies became more complex, especially as populations grew and territories expanded, it became increasingly clear that the lack of a formalized legal system created instability. Tribes and groups that had previously been small and relatively homogeneous began to come into contact with other cultures and peoples, each with their own rules and traditions. This created a chaotic environment, where differences in interpretation of what was fair or legal resulted in constant disputes and conflicts. Economic growth and increased trade also revealed the need for a more organized system in which people could negotiate and resolve disagreements peacefully and fairly. Without a solid legal basis, these exchanges were often risky, with fraud, theft, and abuse occurring without clear penalties. It was in this scenario of increasing social complexity that the idea of creating a set of clear, written laws arose. The need for universal rules for all members of a society became evident. Rather than decisions being made on the sidelines or based on the power of a leader, it would be essential to establish a system where anyone, regardless of their position or influence, could know the rules and what to expect as a consequence of their actions. Creating a code of law required a common understanding of what was acceptable and what was not, promoting a more cohesive vision that was less vulnerable to personal interpretation or manipulation. This meant that the rules, once established, would be applied to everyone without distinction or favoritism. The elaboration of a system of laws for the kingdom or society was not a simple task, as it involved discussions between different groups and leaders. Each faction or social class had its own expectations about how the legal system should work, and there was resistance to the idea of limiting the personal power of the rulers or of equalizing everyone under the same rules. However, the most visionary rulers realized that a legal code would be crucial to guarantee order and justice. It was through these discussions that the first ideas of rights and duties shared by all citizens began to emerge, regardless of their class or social status. The creation of the first laws would not only resolve disputes, but also promote a more harmonious and orderly coexistence. The implementation of the first written laws brought a radical change to the societies of the time. People began to understand that justice no longer depended on the strength or will of a leader, but on a system of rules that everyone could know and to which everyone was equally subject. This meant greater protection for the most vulnerable, who until then had often been subjugated by the most powerful. By being codified and written down, the law became a balancing force, not only to resolve disputes, but also to maintain social cohesion. The first civilizations thus began to realize that justice should not be something fleeting or based on subjectivity, but something solid and accessible to all. This was the first step towards building a more stable and equitable governance. With the establishment of the first written laws, the immediate impact was visible. Society began to realize the benefits of having a clear and uniform legal system, which established not only the rights but also the responsibilities of each individual. People no longer needed to fear that their actions would be judged based on the arbitrariness or personal preferences of rulers, but rather on a set of predefined rules that were accessible to all. This brought a sense of greater security and stability. Those who had previously been oppressed by the lack of a legal system began to feel that their voices and rights could be heard and protected within the new legal framework. In addition, the new laws began to unify society, creating a common ground of understanding that transcended the differences between different groups and tribes. Until then, the interpretation of justice and the resolution of conflicts had varied according to culture and local power, which created divisions and tensions. With the standardization of rules, society began to see itself as a cohesive body, where each person, regardless of their origin, status, or wealth, was subject to the same laws. This process of unification not only strengthened internal relations, but also created a safer environment for those who wanted to establish business or relations with other communities, as the rules of conduct were now clear and applicable to all. The adoption of written laws also brought economic and commercial benefits. Trade between regions, which had previously been marked by distrust and the risk of fraud or exploitation, became safer. Merchants began to operate with greater confidence, as laws ensured that transactions would be protected and that commercial disputes would be resolved fairly. As a result, local and regional economies began to flourish, as people now had greater confidence to invest and innovate. By reducing uncertainty, the codification of laws became an enabler of progress, allowing society to focus on growth rather than constantly worrying about violence or lack of order. The impact of the first written laws also extended to politics and governance. With the advent of a legal code, rulers came to be seen not only as leaders with absolute power, but as administrators of a system based on rules that had to be respected. This new role required them to be more accountable and transparent, as they could no longer make arbitrary or personal decisions without considering the legal implications. Society began to demand more from government, and rulers, in turn, began to understand that their legitimacy and authority depended on the observance of the laws and their fair application. This cycle of accountability and control brought about a new era of governance, where law became the primary force for stability and social cohesion. As the new system of law took hold, its influence extended beyond the borders of the small kingdom, reaching other regions and cultures that observed with interest the benefits of a structured society. The idea of a written legal code that guaranteed justice and order began to be replicated by other rulers who saw laws as a way to ensure political and social stability. The model of the small kingdom, with its clear laws applicable to all, became an example of how society could evolve from a state of chaos and arbitrariness to one of organization and prosperity. Gradually, other kingdoms adopted similar practices, creating their own versions of legal codes that were adapted to their reality, but which still shared the fundamental principle of justice and equality. With the success of the legal system, the small kingdom became a reference for the construction of a new type of governance. The first written laws, which initially sought only to resolve internal disputes, began to be seen as the basis for a new world order. The idea that law could be the force that unified different peoples and cultures spread, and the dissemination of the legal code created a network of societies that shared fundamental principles of justice. This contributed to the emergence of a more peaceful network of interactions between communities, as norms and expectations were now more universal and understood by all. The notion that a kingdom could thrive with a system of governance based on law became an aspirational model for many. This shift in legal structures also had a profound impact on how societies viewed the role of the ruler. The power to govern came to be seen as a duty to apply the law fairly, rather than as an absolute right to decide autocratically. When rulers made decisions, they were now challenged by the population to act within the limits set by the law. This represented an improvement over previous systems, where the leader was the final arbiter and his word was the law. The first written laws helped establish a system of governance that moved away from arbitrariness and towards a more just and accountable government. Over time, the system of written laws became established as one of the fundamental pillars of the societies that would come to form. They were adapted, modified, and expanded as times and the needs of populations changed, but the central idea that laws were a common good and should be followed by all remained. The first laws, which emerged from a small kingdom, evolved to influence not only the way rulers exercised power, but also the way civilizations structured their institutions and societies. The lasting impact of these laws showed that creating a cohesive and accessible legal system was the key to a more peaceful, just, and orderly coexistence, which would continue to evolve for centuries.